Sure that everybody attending knows something of Simon Davis's professional work, but I will start with a very brief review. Simon became the 175th president of the Law Society of England and Wales last summer in 2019. He qualified as a solicitor in 1984 in what is now the global law firm Clifford Chance, and as with many firms, its name changed due to mergers, but Simon has worked in that same firm effectively since he started his career, and in 1994 became a commercial litigation partner in the London office. And in 2008, Simon was appointed a member of the Court of Appeal Mediation Panel. And Simon's very kindly completed some extra details about his career and choices and so on. And those will be on the university's website within the next few days. So thanks for doing that, Simon. I wanted to start off, please, Simon, asking you about when in your inaugural lecture last summer, it seems like a different world now, you set out your main priorities. And I just wondered whether those had changed or how they had developed since the outbreak of COVID-19.
Well, thanks very much, Coral. And let me say straight away, thank you to you, the University of Law, and Westminster and Holborn for taking initiative to bring us all together under this one virtual roof. For those of you who may be wondering about the Law Society President's domestic arrangements, you can probably see I've got Keith Richards actually in the background. You probably won't see it in the gloom. Stark contrast to some of the calls I've had in the last few days, which range from somebody who was in a dark cellar, another person who apparently was lying on an Australian beach, and a third who was the most entrancing of all, who appeared on screen with their young daughter sitting on their knee. And in relation, therefore, back to your question, when I started as the Law Society President, I said that the theme for my year I wanted to be upholding the rule of law, which some people said, well, that's not very original. And to begin with, I thought was going to be absolutely perfect because my life was dominated to an extent by Brexit and what was happening in the Supreme Court. But my essential themes were to ask yourself the question, who is it who upholds the rule of law? And to that extent, with due respect to all of you who are on the line who are not solicitors, for tonight you're all honorary solicitors. But my view was that it was very much the solicitor's profession. And that rights and obligations were created and enforced by and large by solicitors. So what I set out to do with my themes were to want people of all backgrounds and all talents to be able to become solicitors, that when they join firms that they're looked after, and hesitate to use words like nourished and cherished, but that's what I meant. And to be trained in use of technology while keeping ethics very much at the core, to work hard so that people could afford to use that profession, and to spend a great deal of time with government and with the press and regulators, setting out how, I won't say our stall, but yes, to show how the solicitor profession was one which should be used and one which was acting at all times very much in the public interest. Alongside that, of course, I had the side winds of Brexit alongside. But in terms of what's changed, huge. I now spend
I just started, just before you go on to what's changed, a lot of people can't see you now. I wonder if could you just check your video again? See if you can get it back on. We all want to see the picture behind you.
Am I back on?
Afraid not. I don't know why that's happening. It does say on my I've got a sign with that your video's off at the moment.
It shows on mine. What a great shame.
Oh, it does seem to have clicked off now. Well, no, it keeps coming on and off. That is a pity. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, am I on or off? Because according to mine, it's I'm on.
You're off at the moment, I'm afraid. I think we best. Now you've magically appeared. So I think everybody will just have to know that sometimes you're there and sometimes you're not. So okay, sorry.
Well, Keith is looking over my shoulder.
That's Thank you. And I interrupted you. You were just
No, no,
about to go on to
no,
talk about how you're
it's all, it's of course difficult for you and I, since I can't see anyone's reactions. I proceed on the basis that people still hanging in there. So what's changed? Obviously my life has changed dramatically in that I, like all of you, I get out of bed in the morning, shuffle to another room, and sit here for 10 hours. But in terms of the challenges, all the points which I mentioned earlier remain good. But now what I divide life really, I think, is two parts. The first is to make sure that the profession is out there. It's going to sound a bit trite, but it's always difficult to avoid cliches in a situation like this. To make sure that the profession is out there, keeping the wheels of justice turning, making sure that the rule of law hasn't itself been locked down, and doing what we can to support the profession doing its day job. And that every single day, and whoever I'm speaking to, those are the two themes which I'm always focusing on, is what can we do to have transactions working and try to enable people in tragic circumstances to have valid wills, to do everything we can to help people who are trying to have conveyances, and those, of course, who are going into the courts to the extent that they are still open so that justice can still be done, and supporting them, physical, mental, practical, and of course financial.
Thank you. Yes, I could see that continuity that you've talked about. It that is the main issues. Can we now try and narrow down to a few of the points? You've already mentioned the courts, but I'm conscious that there's so many people in private practice with massive challenges at the moment in the face of the pandemic, and I just wondered, how your team is dealing with that. How is that being relayed to the government and so on? If you could give us an insight into that.
Just make sure that people can hear me, because I just see a couple of people were clicking on and messaging, so they might have a trouble. But I'll proceed on the basis that the majority of people can see and
I can certainly. I think most people can hear you. For some reason, your video's coming on and off, so it's not always showing, I'm afraid, Simon. So I don't know why that is. It could be local connection problem or anything, or browser.
Okay. Do you want to repeat the question? I'm sorry, because it was...
Sure, no problem at all. So really, you've given a great overview of the main priorities and how those have really continued during the outbreak, but just with a rather bizarre backdrop. As president, you've always liaised with the government of the day, or that person in the role has. So could you give an insight into how the input and the feedback, the flow of information is going between you and the government?
Yeah, I think one of the huge values of the Law Society during this is that we are everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean that what we have made it our business to do, either by speaking to people remotely or by email, but most recently and fundamentally by surveys. We've been out there with surveys, large, medium, small, obviously with small practitioners, to get as much information as we possibly can and feed that back in to those who count. And when I say those who count, we have a call, I'm on a call together with specialists from the Law Society, criminal practitioners, family practitioners, civil practitioners, quite literally every single day of the week, with the Ministry of Justice, HMCTS, Legal Aid Agency, feeding back to them what is actually happening out there on the ground, most particularly in the courts, but then more generally we'll be talking to government about the difficulties with wills, difficulties with signatures, and the like. And I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but why not? In the last 10 days, I've been on calls with the shadow new Attorney General, just now with the shadow Minister of Legal Aid, the Lord Chief Justice, the Lord Chancellor of the High Court, I'm on this week then with Stuart Glenn, the economic minister, and a little while ago with Robert Buckland. And in each case, what I'm seeking to do is to get across the challenges out there for people who are going to courts, people who are trying to have effective transactions and the like, and seek to get some practical measures in place to help them.
Thank you. I mean, it's brilliant to know that you've got the ear of all these people. And how is the information being collated from private practice? I know there's a staff, obviously, at the Law Society, but I was interested in just how you're dealing with that volume of information and how it's stored for the future use and so on.
Okay, so one of the first things we did relatively early when we moved out of Chancery Lane, we already had the ability to work remotely. We set up a particular coronavirus task force with obviously a lead committee, just like as you'd imagine an effective crisis management task force. They have put up the detailed website where you see all the various frequently asked questions anticipated and answered, coronavirus email, and information is fed in centrally. The relationship managers also who are out there in the regions gathering information, feeding that in to the hub. We then speak, of course, to the local law societies. So the information is then all put together and shared with whoever the relevant people might be. And when I say relevant people, we're of course not just talking to government, but spend a great deal of time talking with the Legal Services Board and with the Solicitors Regulation Authority. I speak to them every week, and we have working parties with them every week as well. Again, a huge value add is sharing information about what is happening across England and Wales.
Okay, thank you. So, as the whole economy at the moment is rolling with the shock of lockdown, I mean, I know that we're all at the moment feeling this all around the world, let alone just England and Wales. But I just wondered if you could give some insight into the assistance that's there for the survival of law firms, and how much does that vary when you're dealing with the largest firms in the city to perhaps a sole practitioner in Wales or in Newcastle?
You're actually surprisingly consistent, Coral, in relation to the main challenge. And the main challenge, it's the falling off of human activity. And as we all know, as solicitors, we don't exist in a vacuum. We only survive, we only do work when clients are active. And it's very hard to predict what kind of inactivity we're talking about and for how long. If we just take some entirely random examples, but the ones which are very fresh with me, and we talk about conveyancing. You may have seen in the Times today report that some £85 billion worth of transactions just glued, 375,000 transactions not taking place. Depending which practitioner you talk to, some talked about the fall off of 80% of their work. Criminal practitioners ranging between 50 to 80% of their work. Family practitioners seeing serious fall off. And then the problem is not in any sense confined to any one sector of the legal profession. You talk to the large firms who tell me at the moment that litigation work continuing, they have the corporate and real estate work tailing off, but that's what's happening now. I think the greater problem, or another great problem, will be 3 to 6 months' time when you see clients unable to spend the kind of money they were before, not knowing where money is going to come from to the extent that they have monetary difficulties. Those who are deferring tax bills, then finding a huge tax bill coming in January. So throughout, you are seeing the combination of lack of present activity and worry about lack of future activity, leading to major cash problems for all firms. And the help, you have the government's support package, which of course has its pluses. Some firms are obviously using furloughs. The extent of that varies from size and nature of firm, but much of the package doesn't fit with the solicitor's profession. We've got no rates relief of any kind. We have sole practitioners out there, many of whom paying themselves through professional services companies. Dividends don't qualify. Some, the more fortunate ones who get over £50,000, find that they're then excluded at all from the scheme. And then we have the last bit, Coral, in relation to loans. The idea for many firms, particularly in the criminal legal aid work, to say to them, well, here is a large loan which will tide you over. It's a loan for many people who are either heavily in debt or at a certain stage in their career and relatively towards the end of their career, the last thing they need is debt. So there is support there, but much of it doesn't fit well with our own profession.
Okay, thank you. And as you're talking about the future, I wanted to ask you about the impact on the developing profession. I know this is a bit of crystal ball territory, but you're talking about 80% drop in work and so on. What is your best guess on what's going to happen? I mean, we're already very short, for example, of legal practitioners who are dealing just with criminal law. What kind of crisis do you think this might cause for the legal profession?
You're going to find, rather like the more general economy, you're going to see a range of views. And I do not think that you are going to see this as some kind of bungee jump world. My own perception is that let's get back to the criminal legal work. And the only reason I'm focusing on that, ladies and gentlemen, is just because that is dominating my life in the last 48 hours. But there, what you hear from government and indeed from the press out there is that what you're going to see as we emerge from lockdown is suddenly this explosion of work. You hear that being said in the context of corporate and M&A, that when we're released, there's going to be this explosion of work. I'm just entirely unconvinced by that. Of course, there will be more work, but in relation to, say, criminal work, the courts were ill-equipped to deal with some of the work that was there in the first place. I think that what you're more likely to see, it's not so much V-shaped or U-shaped. I think you're likely to see a long and flat recovery. And a long and flat recovery means that the firms who are in serious trouble now, I think, are going to find it very difficult to pull themselves out in the time ahead.
Thank you. And concentrating on criminal, partly because it has, as you say, been so much in the papers, and it's the one area where we've had to keep justice going. I was talking to a practitioner the other day who's doing Zoom interviews when someone's when someone's been arrested, etc. And I just wondered if you could give me some overview about how you've been involved in the changes to making the courts move online, whether they've met those challenges, what's happened to jury trials and so on.
Okay, so it's quite a sort of smorgasbord out there, but if I just start, let's say, in the commercial civil arena, which isn't quite so heavily trial dependent, but there's been, I think, considerable and successful use. The fallback default is Skype for Business, but by and large they've had the attitude that if necessary with Zoom and others that they'll make that work. I think quite a successful story. It gets much harder when you move away from those kind of cases, and I'll just dwell for a moment, say on Crown Courts, juries. The challenge of having 12 people moving around a court, leaving aside the rest of practitioners, it was far too difficult to carry on with. There's now a working party looking at that. You've got the Law Society is part of it, and they're going to have to consider every single option. But safety will come first. I think that is going to take some while for jury trials to come online. Magistrates courts less of a challenge. And by the way, in relation to to juries, I think the idea that, well, why don't we do that remotely, I think would be a very problematic step, and entirely inconsistent with what we regard, quite rightly, as the way in which justice is done in this country, with people being able to look at the defendant, look at the witnesses truthfully in the eye. And the last point on that, I do think that we have to take very seriously that justice needs not just to be done, but seen to be done. And I'm not sure that people are really going to consider that they've seen justice done and had justice done just remotely. Magistrates' courts, less difficulty since you don't have the juries. Technology being used, I think, quite well. Two problems tends to be that although we're now seeing much greater use of cloud video platforms, you still need to make sure that people on the ground know how they work. The kind of sort of basic issues which we're all familiar with when we're out there ourselves using Zoom and Skype. And the last point on that is it all takes much longer for things to happen. And those delays, particularly again for people who, let's say, are on fixed fees, having to spend so much more time doing things, that creates a whole new extra problem. So I think technology is actually working quite well, but has this, as I said, the side effects. It's not a substitute.
Yeah. Okay. I was interested last week. I attended an online conference, and the people from Australia were saying that they now have almost like a fire drill 1 week every year where the courts have to be online. And I think that's because they experienced SARS in the past. So it'd be interesting to see how that progresses here. I can see people are starting to put excellent questions up in the chat box. So I will just ask one more question, if I may.
Absolutely.
And that's really moving on to the wider issue of the rule of law. And of course, with our normal liberties in the UK have been suspended, we're all under lockdown. Could you give some insight into the implications on the short and long term suspension of all these freedoms that we take for granted?
Well, I think if we start not just with the United Kingdom, but internationally, I think there is a very considerable concern. I won't mention the countries, but I was only just this morning seeing an email from one part of the world with great concern that governments out there may be taking advantage of the present situation to take a very tight grip of their country, to start to impose all kinds of restrictions on liberties of speech and gathering which are taken for granted. We have here, may come as a surprise to some, and some people may think it's too light, but a relatively light regime. I heard again only today that there is an increase in the number of arrests being carried out by police in some parts of the country for people infringing regulations. And I think if you do get to a situation in this country which takes so seriously the essential liberties of people gathering together, spending time doing what they want whenever they want, that having restrictions such as that, the focus has to be that these are absolutely temporary, absolutely exceptional. We are not and must never be a police state. So I would be very concerned as the president of the Law Society if any of the steps which are being taken at the moment were in any sense regarded as anything other than completely extraordinary and completely exceptional for these kind of circumstances, and should be, in relation to restrictions on liberties, removed as quickly as we are satisfied that it is sufficiently safe to do so.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move now to some of the questions that have come up in the chat box, and they're quite substantial. So if we can just, there's a lot of people online, so if I can try and take these slowly. So Tawinder Singh is asking, first of all, whether further mergers are likely to allow firms to stay viable, and also whether we will reduce offshoring of legal services. I don't know if you've got a view on those two quite interesting points.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted actually I'm on this session because I've never even thought about either of those questions. I think in relation to mergers, I heard last week I was speaking to one criminal firm, and they told me they had already been approached by another criminal firm with a view to see whether not so much merger, but could some of their people be taken on by that criminal firm because they thought they weren't going to be able to continue. I think that the reality of life is whichever particular part of the legal profession you are thinking about, if the results of this in the short or medium term are that cash flow problems become such that a firm just feels it cannot carry on, then I think you are right. You are likely to see mergers of some kind. In relation to offshoring, offshoring, I think, has become very much a part of the natural service world because of the reduced cost. I see no reason why that should change, particularly because this morning I was speaking with somebody who's a forensic support professional, and he said that much of their work already in relation to data retrieval, data analysis is all being dealt with online. So I don't see any reason why that should change, and if necessary, will increase if people are even more cost constrained.
Okay, and just one quick follow-up from Tawinder as well is, will law tech reduce the costs, allowing further viability of firms? So we're always being told we can actually save money with law tech, and I'm conscious that earlier on you mentioned things take longer sometimes with all of the tech we've got, but I don't know if you've got a view on that.
I think something really interesting is going to be happening in the wake of this. In the past, Tawinder and others, there was regularly a discussion about where technology can best be used and where can't it be. And I've always taken the view that what a law firm needs to really focus on is what part of your service requires you to have a personal relationship with your client and what doesn't. In other words, what part of your service you don't even need to know who the client is. And in relation to the first, really focus on making sure that people who are dealing with that client are not acting in a robotic way, that they're being empathetic, problem solving, getting under the skin of the client. And I think what you're going to see coming out of this is people having much more focus on, hey, actually, in some of these areas of the work that we do, you do need human beings, but we haven't been spending enough time as human beings and being trained as human beings. And which part of our work should we already have been doing using technology and the like? So I'm not one of those people who thinks that in the wake of this, you're going to see offices close down and people move out of offices. Funny enough, I think you may see in some areas the other way around, that people realizing actually how important office life is, bouncing ideas off each other, walking down corridors, spending time, having clients face to face. I think you might see actually a greater focus on the human being, while at the same time saying actually some of the uses of technology which people may have been worried about have worked very well. So I think it's going to be really quite exciting.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go now to Megan, who's asked about the training of qualification of future lawyers and to what extent that will be affected. Could there be longer training periods? I know there's been issues about trainees being on furlough, pushback qualifications and so on. It's not just general insight.
No, you've got sort of a whole series of answers to that. One, you'll have seen in relation to the discussions which we have all the time with the SRA, that the SRA are being, hesitate to use the word flexible because that sounds as if they're being weak. They're not. They're actually being quite pragmatic in relation to making sure that people were able to take their exam this year. It was going to be deferred, and they're being quite pragmatic about people who won't be able to complete now possibly some of the modules in the LPC. In relation to people who have already got their training contracts, I would hope that the SRA consistent with so far their attitude, will be very pragmatic about the extent to which they are concerned that trainees aren't being adequately supervised since they're no longer in the office. I don't know what your own experience is, but mine so far, what I've been hearing from solicitors firms, funny enough, is because they now know that they know there is a challenge with making sure that trainees are being looked after. That if anything, their supervision is becoming more active, and they have diarised morning calls and afternoon calls with the trainees to make sure they're okay and being supervised. So I hope if you're in the right kind of firm, that you shouldn't see much difference in relation to the level of supervision you're getting. And to the extent that there are problems, I hope you're going to find the SRA being quite sympathetic to that.
Okay, yes, because I've got one specific question from somebody who's asking, she's on furlough during her traineeship, and what happens if they eventually make her redundant? What are her options really? But I guess you're saying talk to the Solicitors Regulation Authority and see what flexibility there is.
I get on to them pretty quickly, they treat everything as anonymous. You can have a very good call with them. Just talk about the impact of furlough, and to the extent you find that you're not getting a good answer, it's still their business. But you let me know, and I'll happily talk to them. But I think you'll find that they're being quite pragmatic.
That sounds very reassuring. Thank you. Okay, I'll go to some of the queries from qualified solicitors. So one is about in-house, and it's saying naturally this depends on the business sector, but there's concern that the amount of solicitors practicing in-house are likely to reduce. Is that your view, that that's likely because of COVID-19?
I'd be interested in the questioner expanding on that as to why they think the reasons might be. I don't think that's likely, leaving aside, as you say, the business imperative, because of two reasons. And by the way, I had calls with two sets of in-house lawyers last week to replace a rather nice dinner we were going to have, because I have dinners on different topics around the year. So I had two sets of in-house firms, in-house teams, ranging from the charities sector right the way up to a major petroleum company, and their view was that the only reason why they may find there were going to be less in-house later on was if the cost constraints were such that they just couldn't afford to have those lawyers. But in terms of, they thought of the attractiveness of in-house, they saw no reason why that should change. People enjoying very much their lives in-house, and I don't think that is likely to change. If anything, what one of them said I thought was really interesting was that all of them, by the way, made a remark about the disparity between the kind of salaries they saw in the external sector and those they saw in-house. A number of them said quite pointedly they thought that was one of the reasons why external law firms were expensive, but leave that to one side. But they said that they thought that what may happen is as you're going to see possibly pay levels tumbling out there, that they thought they might see more people come in-house because they looked more in reach in terms of their salaries. I couldn't possibly comment on that, but it was just an interesting remark they made. I don't see a big change.
Sorry, Simon. I think there's probably a whole other discussion there. I can see people are sending in comments about most of their people are on furlough and they think that the lawyers might be the last to go back and so on. But can I move on to something slightly different? I want to try, and I won't be able to take all of the questions because they're really beginning to pour in now, and we've only got another 5 minutes.
Well, no, as long as you want.
Thank you. So someone's just asking about the government's job retention scheme and the payment of furlough leave, and what's your view on wealthy firms that are using that? Who's asking whether they're in the same boat as Premier League football clubs who've got deep enough pockets to survive, and what do you think about it? Do you think it's ethical to take the furlough money?
I think you'll find across the piece that what's happening at what I might call the bigger end, and be under no illusion that there aren't major problems with the major firms. That's why you were seeing firm after firm out there announcing that effectively they've stopped paying partners money. What their drawings, what they're going to do, all of them, I think, sensibly, is going to conserve cash with a view to seeing what is going to happen in the near to longer term. In relation to furloughs, certainly in terms of all the firms that I've spoken to, which is a fair number, the only times where I'm seeing furloughs being used is in relation to business support, not in relation to lawyers. And again, that what these firms will be doing is looking not just over the next few weeks. They're going to be looking very much to the future to make sure that they're going to be in a position to keep taking on trainees. That you don't want firms to start reducing their numbers, to still have trainees qualifying. And I hope you'll find that they are not in any sense like anybody else who may be out there and put up as a target. I'm encouraged by firms, whichever ones I speak to, ranging from the small to the large. They all start with the word people, and I'm very encouraged by that.
Okay, thank you. I can see some, again, I think it's probably quite a big issue, but it's perhaps something that people could feed back direct to the Law Society, because some of the people are putting up that they are actually qualified lawyers and they're on furlough, and some of them are in larger firms. So perhaps that's an issue they could filter into the Law Society, as you say.
Yeah, you do because that's the first I've heard of that. So no, you want to send me an email, and I won't mention who you are. Just I'll expunge your name, and then I'll have a gentle word. But again, I'm not saying it'd be wrong for them to be using furloughs for lawyers. As I said, all I'm hearing at the moment is that it's in relation to business services, but I'm not saying that business services are in any sense second-class citizens. What I'm saying is that the firms will be doing what they can to make sure that they are sustainable for the future.
Okay, thank you. So I've got two other questions which I thought I'd pick because they're quite different to what we've been talking about so far. One is about compliance, and it's asking whether you think that money launderers will exploit the lockdown, and how do you think firms can react to this or be aware of it, any precautions that they should be taking?
In fact, it was a particular subject which I covered most recently with the in-house teams, and I said, are you worried that to the extent you're now having to do everything remotely and everything online, that there may be people who are now going to be tempted to get away with things now that they can't actually be spotted? And the answer to that was of course, I don't want to be naive, nor were they. If something is happening, you won't necessarily know that it is. But certainly their perception was that compliance and rules and regulations were being taken extremely seriously. I would have thought, just as the same with the general public, that of course there are going to be villains out there who think now's my time to take advantage. But I'm quite sure that firms, most of whom, perhaps all of whose protections are in any way cyber and online, will be on the alert, and I don't see any reason why people should be maybe trying to do more, but I don't see any reason why they should succeed more.
Okay, thank you very much. Someone's saying, in connection with that, do you think there'll be a shift towards identifying potential clients remotely with the kind of the lockdown? Sorry, the question came up and then disappeared, so I haven't got the whole thing. I don't know if you can forward it to me, Leonor. But I think it was a follow-up question on risk and compliance and just what checks we need to do with people who are remote clients. Although I think there are some already, aren't there? We already request various documents and so on.
I think this is going to come back to that. The very good question you asked about civil liberties. There are clearly, let's take wills as an example. A great number of people, quite understandably, and the Law Society is with them, saying surely something must be done right now for people who want, for obvious tragic reasons, to be entering into valid wills, but can't have people come in and be there physically present to be witnesses. And to begin with, you say, well, that's blindingly obvious. You must do something which just enables you to do this effectively remotely. And then you have a number of people who say, well, no, this is absolutely outrageous. The whole reason why we have the 200-year Act is to stop exploitation. So there's always this balance between trying to be more flexible and then finding you've actually, by being more flexible, allowed in the exploiters. And the same point applies in relation to compliance, money laundering, know your client checks. It's very tempting to say, oh, we've always insisted too much on paperwork. It's all working very well remotely. You just need to be very careful that you don't throw away all the perfectly good reasons why you had the need for paperwork in the first place.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move now to the issue about going into court. I've got a particular question from Rahil Shahid and asking what guidance is the Law Society giving to solicitors if they're being asked to attend court? Because of course some people are being asked to go in. I saw a very sad plea from a trainee recently on social media saying, before the judge asks for a paper set of the files, can they think about me trudging in on the tube terrified and going getting documents? Well, it's probably the same for some of the people going into court. Is there any particular guidance the Law Society is giving?
I think the most simple guidance, and the Law Society is giving it, is if you as an individual think that by going into court you're going to be placing your health at risk, then the most important point is not to listen to the judge. It's to speak straight away to somebody within your office, your supervisor or a partner or anybody, to say, there is this court that I'm supposed to be going into. I'm worried about going to it because my health is going to be at risk for the following reason. And what can you do to reassure me? It may be because there are certain hearings I know, particularly, for example, those involving, let's say, children, where some kind of physical presence is still required. But in relation to those courts, the courts which are open, the hub magistrates courts, for example, these are ones where they're supposed to be, they're deep cleaned all the time. Obviously, I can't cover what's happening in relation to the tubes, but again, if you're worried, speak to somebody in your office and see what practical solutions there may be. I mean, the guidance we've given is you shouldn't be going into court if it's not safe when you're there.
Thank you very much. So I will finish, because although there's quite a few other points, I think some of them are actually answered on the Law Society's website, which has got really full details on what guidance is being given. But there's one final question which I thought would be quite good to finish with, Simon, which is against not actually directly on COVID, but like what's happened to Brexit, basically. So someone's saying, within this context, what are we going to be doing about the Brexit negotiations, and how is the Law Society dealing with Brexit alongside this pandemic?
Thank you very much, questioner. It's bizarre that it's actually a pleasure to be talking about Brexit for a moment and to be asked about Brexit. Who knew I'd say that a year ago? The short point to that is the Law Society is part of the International Law Committee, where we met only recently with Alex Chalk, who's now dealing from the point of view of the Ministry of Justice with Brexit. And the reality of life, as has been reported in the press, is that negotiations are continuing. The government will continue to be pressing for accession to Lugano Treaty. We applied for that on the 8th of April. So the Law Society is in the same position as everybody else, which is that unless and until the government asks for an extension, which would have to be done by the end of June, and you'll have seen publicly there's no sign of that request being made, that unless that request is made, we continue as usual, and we continue to support the government in the ask which we say needs to be made for legal services and for practitioners and for citizens and corporates to be able to choose the lawyers and the laws and the jurisdiction they want. So business as usual in that respect. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much. No, it's a good question. I thought it would be quite interesting to just think about Brexit for a moment, which, as you say, dominated everything until so recently. Well, thank you again. Thank you to the audience for tuning in to listen to this. Just a reminder that there will be a Q&A, which Simon has kindly provided us with for our website. If you are looking for Law Society updates and you look at the actual website, there's lots and lots of material there that you can help with, and as Simon's been saying, you can send in queries either direct there or to one of the officers. And finally, I would mention there's also a hardship fund that's been set up by the Solicitors Benevolent Association. So if you look at the SBA website, there's also assistance there, and lots of nice messages coming in, Simon, which you can't see, saying thank you to you, and it was an interesting talk and all the rest of it.
Okay, can I just conclude just with a couple of things? I mean, first of all, to all of you who are qualified out there or acting as trainees, a massive thank you for everything that you are doing in these horrendous circumstances. The feedback that we get from the kind of people I've been talking about what the legal profession is doing, what the solicitor's profession is doing to get stuck in to support the public throughout is absolutely fabulous. So thank you. And for those of you who are thinking, ooh, should I become a solicitor? Ooh, we're not sure about that. Absolutely. Come on in. The water's lovely. You become solicitor to help people who are in trouble, to help or keep them out of trouble. There's going to be a huge number of people in trouble, and they need talented people like you. So come on in. Don't be put off by anything I might have said today.
Fantastic positive end. Thank you so much. So we'll be in touch, Simon, and see if we can nag you for another session. Lots of people are saying maybe you could come back.
Very happy.
Thank you so much, everybody. I think I'll hand over to Maria now, who I think will be turning us all off.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, Maria and Lenore, who've been in the background.
Lenore. Thank you, Lenore.
Everything on all the kind of technology and all the rest of it.
Thank you. Worked really well.
Bye, everybody. A very big thank you to Simon, to Coral, to all our alumni and guests here this evening. Hopefully we'll get Simon back in a few weeks' time and we'll ensure no technical difficulties. Thank you all.
I'm delighted.
Bye.
Good night.